Hey guys, my name is Cassidy and you're watching That Spooky Lifestyle, where we bring the ooky, the spooky, the creepy and the crawly into our everyday lives. This is the third video in my 4-part series about the Amityville property and the weird events that occurred there from 1974 to 1976. Today we're going to be talking about how these malevolent forces afflicted some of the more spiritually connected people who tried to help the Lutz family during their haunting. Then we're going to talk about the seances that Ed and Lorraine Warren performed on the Amityville property and the weird things they experienced. But before we dive in, let's take a quick look at what we talked about last time. As the event started to intensify, they shifted more from affecting things around Kathy and George to physically attacking them. George recalls one incident where he woke up in the middle of the night and heard marching band noises so loud that he really thought someone was in the house, so he got out of bed and ran downstairs, and the minute his foot hit the landing on the main flooring, the entire house went silent. So it was really loud, really loud, really loud. He got all the way downstairs and then his foot touches the floor and then it's stillness. That would be so terrifying. He said that as he was kind of standing there looking around what the hell's going on, he felt a breath kind of go by him up the stairs. And so that's when he was like, I need to go back to Kathy to make sure she's okay, and he bolts back up. Spooktacular. I'll link it above in case you haven't seen it yet, but I do highly recommend watching part 1 and part 2 before watching this video, or else it's not going to make much sense. But if you're ready to get started, let's jump right in. All throughout the haunting that afflicted George and Kathy Lutz during their 28-day stay at the Amityville property, they were in constant contact with their family priest, whose name was Father Frank Pecoraro. Let's just say God did not shield him from the malevolent forces that plagued 112 Ocean Avenue. And like all good stories, we must start again at the beginning. It's December 18th, 1975, and this is the very first day the Lutz family moved into the Amityville house. Father Frank awoke with an apprehensive feeling in the pit of his stomach. When he reflects on this day, he says it was quite confusing because he had no real reason to be stressed out or worried. He had a number of standard tasks to do this day, and one of them included blessing the Lutz family home. It was a little after 1:30 when he showed up at the Amityville property. Father Frank entered the home with his holy water and started his ritual blessing, and on the first flick of his holy water, he heard a deep masculine voice say, "Get out." He immediately looked around to see if anyone was around him, and he couldn't see anyone. But remember, at this time, the Lutz family is still moving in. There's boxes coming in, people are going back and forth, there's kids running around. He just kind of rationalized it away as oh, it's one of the kids, or it was, someone else talking. So he continued blessing the house, and then when he was done, he got in his car to go to his mother's because he was headed there for a visit. It was a little after 8 p.m. when he was done visiting with his mom and decided to head back to the rectory. On the drive home, he had a very unusual experience. It felt like someone was trying to drive his car into the shoulder or the side of the road, and even though he looked around, there was no vehicles around him that would be pushing his car that way, and he was the only person in his vehicle at this time. As Father Frank is trying to combat this invisible force that's trying to push his car into the side of the road, the hood of his car flips up and smashes his windshield. Then his car stalled all by itself, which would be a pretty spooky experience in general, but again, I could easily see you rationalizing this away as like the car's just acting up. It's just, you know, something isn't working right, causing it to shift to one side of the road. He was able to get a ride home from another priest, but this incident did shake him up a bit, and he was, you know, a bit tense, a bit scared by what happened. The week after Father Frank blessed the Amityville house, he came down with a terrible flu, the type where you'd alternate between getting chills and then getting hot sweats and then being chilled and then getting hot sweats, that very fever-driven kind of flu. Father Frank also recalls this being a really awful time to get sick because it's the Christmas season. At this point, Christmas is only a few days away, and he has a lot of clerical duties and responsibilities that he needs to take care of, so this is really an awful time for a priest to get sick. On top of having these flu-like symptoms, Father Frank continued to have that worried, anxious feeling in the pit of his stomach, and again, he really couldn't rationalize it or explain it. During this time, he warned the Lutz family numerous times about different rooms in their house. One time he called saying like, stay out of the sewing room, there's a really bad energy in that room, don't go in it, don't let the kids go in it. It got to the point where he started dreaming about the Amityville house and when he was there, and just the weird feelings that he received. The weird thing is during this time when George Lutz and Father Frank tried to connect with each other or call each other during this whole 28-day stay that the family was in that house, a lot of the time the phone wouldn't ring, or the line would go dead, or the line would start making this really weird fuzzy loud noise to the point where they couldn't hear each other. There was a lot of supernatural activity surrounding the Lutz family getting any help from the church. During this time, Father Frank started to experience more and more supernatural events himself. Like the more he tried to warn the Lutzes to leave the house or get out of certain rooms, his physical ailments would flail up. He started getting these intense blisters on his hands, and they would be hot to touch and really itchy. And almost every time he got off a call with George Lutz, his hands would start to ache or itch. At one point, Father Frank walked back to his bedroom and the entire room smelled like human feces, and it wasn't just Father Frank smelling it, other priests in the hall could smell it, and it was all coming from his room, and there wasn't any reason for it. They couldn't find a source for the smell. Father Frank ended up being so plagued by these events that he refused to go back to the Amityville property, even though Kathy and George Lutz begged him on multiple occasions to come back and re-bless the house. Which would be such an awful position for Kathy and George, to like really feel like you need additional help and your priest just won't even show up to your house. Like, okay. However, Father Frank did plead with the Lutz on multiple occasions to just leave the house, get out, like it's not safe there. And Father Frank also elevated the Lutz's ailments to the bishop, because Father Frank did really believe that the Amityville house needed to be exorcised. Now, the church's stance on this was that things don't get possessed, people do. And like we all know, you can't just go around and perform an exorcism on anyone that you think should have it. So the church referred George and Kathy Lutz to a paranormal research team, and the research team would basically determine whether this activity was diabolical and, you know, the church needed to get more involved, or if there were different explanations for why all of this activity was happening. Once Father Frank elevated his concerns about the Amityville house to the bishop, he really took an entire step back from the situation. He stopped trying to get a hold of Kathy and George Lutz and really just distanced himself from it. And at this point, his physical ailments did start to heal. Something to keep in mind though, this paranormal researcher that was was supposed to come over to the Amityville property. Because of basically scheduling conflicts and then bad weather, they ended up not coming until after the Lutz family had already fled the property. So really the Lutz family got zero help while they were in the house. Basically, Father Frank came the very first day to bless the home, and then at least at this point, they didn't receive any further help from the church. During this time where the Lutz family had already contacted the church and was waiting for this paranormal researcher to show up, they did also get in contact with a medium and asked her to walk through their house. The next spiritually connected person we're going to talk about is Francine. Now, this isn't her real name. I couldn't find her real name, so we're just going to call her Francine from now on. Backtracking a little bit, when the hauntings in the Amityville house started to increase, this medium called George and said to look for a well on their property. And unknown to her, George had already found a well in their basement that same day. She told him to look for this well because she had a feeling that that's where this evil, malevolent being was coming from, and it could come out of the well or go back in whenever it wanted, which is why the activity seemed to ebb and flow. Just the thought of some dark, creepy being like crawling in and out of this well in their basement is just a spooky thought in general. Fast forwarding to only a few days before the Lutz family ended up leaving their home, Francine and her boyfriend decided to come over so Francine could do a walkthrough. Now, her boyfriend worked for George, and that's how they knew of her, and this whole situation got started. As she was walking through the house, Francine said that she felt two lost souls in the kitchen. Specifically, it felt like a feminine energy and a masculine energy, just human spirits that were sort of lost in this room. As she moved upstairs, she felt a really negative energy in the sewing room and in Maddie's room. During this walkthrough, Francine took on a completely different voice, and George actually thought that it sounded like Father Frank. Nearing the end of the walkthrough, Francine was upstairs and leaned on the second floor banister. At this point, she really started to get a really negative energy and said that they needed to leave. She told the Lutz family that she thought the house needed to be exorcised, and she said that she did feel a very negative presence in this house. So everyone walked downstairs. George and Kathy, thanked them for coming and let them go out the front door. And when they turned around and looked upstairs, the second floor banister that Francine had been leaning on was completely ripped off the wall. No one heard anything. It was just completely out of the wall, even though 5 minutes ago they had just been leaning on it. That would be such a trippy experience. Like, that would just immediately put that sinking feeling in the bottom of your stomach. It would just be like, ugh. It would just be a very scary experience overall. Alright, now we're going to jump ahead a bit to February 18th, 1976. This is roughly a little over a month since the Lutz family fled the Amityville property. On this night, an official seance was to be held at the 112 Ocean Avenue property. Kathy and George Lutz were both invited, but they refused to set foot back in that house. To help provoke the spirits and open up communications, there were candles all spread out through the downstairs area, especially focusing on the dining room where the seance would be taking place. And a crucifix was placed on the center of the dining room table. So there were a number of people who were invited to this seance, all being professionals in their own fields. There was obviously Lorraine Warren, who was the clairvoyant, Ed Warren, the demonologist, and along with those two, there were psychics Mary Pasquarella and Mrs. Albert Riley. There was also George Kokoris of the Psychical Research Institute of North Carolina. This was the paranormal researcher who was supposed to come while the Lutz family was still in the house, but for a number of unforeseen circumstances, it did not make it to the property until this seance. There were also 2 observers, Mike Linder from a local radio station and Steve Petropoulos, who was a cameraman. So these 2 were watching the seance but weren't sitting at the dining room table. They weren't participating in any way. They weren't talking to any of the spirits. They were just there to observe. Lastly, there was Marvin Scott from New York's Channel 5 who wanted to investigate the rumors of this supposed haunted house. The first seance happened at roughly 10:30 p.m. During this seance, Mary Pasquarella, one of the psychics, became violently ill, so much so that she had to break the seance circle and completely leave the room. Then Mrs. Riley, the other psychic, started to go into a trance-like state and started gasping, which would be super scary if you were sitting next to her and she started having like a physical reaction like that. Mrs. Riley started saying, "It's up here, it's in the bedroom. What's in this house makes my heart race." She's like, "My heart is pounding," and just started kind of expressing how she was feeling in that moment, which again would be terrifying. At this point, her trance broke, and then she just went back to normal. Like, her body went back to normal, her voice went back to normal. It was just a very surreal experience. Interestingly enough, the paranormal researcher George also became very ill and had to leave the room. Mike Linder from the radio station also said that at this point he started to feel a chill and a numbness go through his fingers. Mary Pasquarella finally came back into the room, and with a shaky voice she explained that she saw this really large black presence. This presence was moving around the house and made her feel like she was personally threatened. Lorraine Warren chimed in and said, "Whatever is here is, in my estimation, most definitely of a negative nature. It has nothing to do with anyone who had once walked the earth in human form. It is right from the bowels of the earth." So now that everyone's back, they're back sitting in their seats, the cameraman Steve actually decided to go upstairs just to start wandering around and checking out different areas of the house. And when he entered the sewing room, he started to have a very quick heart rate, and he started to feel really anxious and nervous for no real reason, which was unusual for him because he had filmed previously in like combat zones and things like that, so you'd think that like an empty sewing room would have no reason to affect him. Lorraine Warren and Marvin Scott both went into the sewing room after Steve and said that they could feel a really cold chill in the air. As they were wandering through the house, Ed and Lorraine Warren both agreed that they could feel a strong negative presence in the living room. Lorraine also stated that whatever is here is able to move around at will. It doesn't have to stay here, but I think it's a resting place. She also thought that negative forces could be centered around statues and non-living things. Sort of conflicting with the church's view, where the church was all like, no, it's only people that get sort of infested with demonic beings. Lorraine actually thought that inanimate objects could also get negative energy stored into them. Lorraine was also very adamant that this was a demonic spirit. It was not like a negative person. They did agree that there were multiple spirits or beings in the house, but there was definitely a demonic force there. It wasn't all just like negative human spirits, it was like a negative demonic entity. Lorraine also indicated negative energy coming from the fireplace and the banister, having no prior knowledge of the weird events that had occurred at those locations previously. At 3:30 a.m., the Warrens tried a second seance, but nothing really happened, and all the psychics in the room basically agreed that the energy they had felt previously had been neutralized. During these seances, Lorraine had also brought a relic of a saint with her to the Amityville property. No one but her and Ed Warren knew that she had brought it with her, just sort of for protection. And she didn't tell anyone about this relic while they were there. It was just like a personal token or talisman for her. After Ed and Lorraine Warren had returned home, they received a phone call from one of the individuals who was at the seance taking photos, and they described this one photo they took, that there was a figure in the photo that looked exactly like the saint that Lorraine had brought with her. Whenever Ed and Lorraine talk about the Amityville house, they always say that the presence in that house was really the personification of evil. Unfortunately, after they left the property, that wasn't the last of the hauntings or supernatural events that Ed and Lorraine would experience from the Amityville house. In many interviews, they also state that this was one of the worst cases that they worked on because it affected them on such a personal level. Ed and Lorraine Warren both experienced multiple personal attacks after the Amityville case, and Lorraine refuses to talk about Amityville in a moving car or a moving plane, like any sort of transportation. She just refuses to talk about this case. Lots of their attacks have to do with being paralyzed or not being able to focus. They call this Diabolical Confusion, and it's basically when a demonic entity is trying to attack you. It kind of disorients you, so you don't really know what's happening or where you are. Obviously, they attribute their strong faith as to why they could banish these evil spirits when they're attacked, but just that whole idea of going somewhere and bringing something evil back with you, especially to your home where you're supposed to be safe or you're supposed to feel safe, is a super spooky thought. Now there is one more video in this Amityville series, and I thought we'd end the series exactly how we started it, with the DeFeo family. So in part 1, we talked about the official police statement of what happened on November 13th, 1974. And next week, we'll be talking about Ronnie Jr.'s personal account of what happened the night he murdered his family. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. Subscribe to this channel so you don't miss next week's video. Find me on Instagram if you enjoy witchy content and Halloween edits. Find me on Facebook if you enjoy Halloween memes. Thank you guys so much for hanging out with me, and I'll see you in my next video.